So I came across this video of Trevor Bauer and Michael Lorenzen going over Michael Lorenzen's mechanics online a couple years ago. I watched it at least 10 times. It's an awesome video. I think there's a few concepts that are a little harder to understand, so we're gonna break it down further. We're gonna use the handy dandy pelvis, and hopefully that'll give you a better idea about what they're talking about and make their insights even more impactful to your career.
Try to get as low as possible, like try to almost do a single leg squat. That's gonna allow you to get in a position where you can use the back leg better to actually push the hip socket open, as opposed to just kind of like drifting forward and waiting till you land.
Right or wrong, this is what I'm trying to do. I noticed during spring training that my velo would go up without me necessarily trying to do any more effort. Like on leg lift, I would get that shin angle geared more towards, see how my knee's drifting there?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get that shin angle going that way a little bit in order to create that momentum towards home plate. And then the only thing I'm thinking now after that is maintain contact with the rubber. Not just my whole foot with the ground for as long as I can while I try and rotate my hips. That's what I'm thinking about the lower half.
So one of the main points of the video is talking about, basically Bauer's talking about the idea of holding external rotation. We definitely teach that to some guys, but not everyone. Why is that?
I think it's important to look at the actual anatomy of each athlete, the hip structure. Guys that, typically we see guys that either bias IR or bias ER. I think if you're gonna bias IR, you won't have the same cues as someone who biases ER, maybe has a good amount of range of motion with both.
Okay, so if someone is limited in external rotation of the hip, we're not going to force them to get there, is basically what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
And then if someone is able to do both, we would then cue what Bauer was talking about with the external rotation,
yes.
holding the external rotation.
Correct, yes.
So can you demonstrate that exactly what you just said of the difference between the two?
So with guys that have IR, or are biased towards the IR, we want to get them to hold that range of motion as long as possible, right? So the best way to do that is going to be to get a little bit of a coil in the hip in order to hold that range of motion down the slope, right? Whereas a guy with that bias is ER, we're gonna try to keep that back knee more vertical down the slope longer than we would with a guy who biases IR.
So that was what he's talking about with the shin angle when Lorenzen was talking about what he's saying about his shin angle.
Correct.
And then the other main point that I liked a lot was being able to hold that position without the hip height.
Yes.
So can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, so a lot of guys get into the position where they get into that big hip hike down the slope. And what that actually does is when we get here, instead of getting a true coil with the pelvis, we're actually, our first move down the slope is gonna be collapsing into IR and not holding that IR. So we're gonna, before we even go down the slope, we're gonna be losing that range of motion.
Okay, so we have to make sure the first domino to fall is not setting ourselves up into a position to fail.
Correct. By
getting into IR, putting ourselves in a position where we kind of have to get into IR when we're riding the slope, ride the slide, however you want to say it.
Yep.
Is that accurate? Okay.
That's happening, which is good. I just think that like with how powerful you are in the lower half, like you should be able to get into this like more dropping position as opposed to this here.
I 100% agree. So the thing is, the whole drop and drive thing, I think has been in my mind, like, well, I don't want to drop and drive. And so now that makes sense with what you're saying in the sense of, well, your weight's not over your foot. Drop and drive is just like having a balance point over the rubber, dropping down and pushing out. And I knew I'm like, that's not right. So I'm not going to drop and drive.
And then the other thing that I was going to say is you want to think about the back leg and the back hip, like your quad area and your hip socket almost being locked together, where you're not internally rotating the femur, you're locking it with the hip socket and rotating the hip socket as a whole. So like right here, I'm not internally rotating my knee, it's turning the hip socket. And from here, I'm locked in a position because I've dropped into like I've gotten depth on the back leg, that I can actually, when I drive from this position, it's pushing the hip socket open as opposed to like extending the leg, almost like you're doing a side broad jump or something like that.
Yeah.
So you don't want to extend because that doesn't rotate the hips. But when you drop into this position, as long as you've gotten your center of mass out front when you go to drop, it's going to position your hip socket in a way that when you do drive off the back leg, it's going to pop the hips open.
So just to help visualize it even more, what's happening on an anatomical level is when we get into that load position they talked about, we're gonna be in internal rotation. So the femur will be slightly internal rotated, and then we're gonna open up that posterior outlet. This is gonna be the position that we try to hold right here as we're drifting down the mound. Once we get into a position where we're hitting, so we're here, we're holding that internal rotation of the back leg, we land, and as we start to go, we want to think the femur and the back hip are connected and they're rotating together, as opposed to the ilium or the pelvis staying still and just the femur moving. So if we're looking at this side, we're gonna hold this as long as we can, drift down the mound. This side's gonna hit, it's gonna open up, and then this side with the back side, the bone here, and the femur are gonna rotate together as we go through, instead of one staying still and the other one going. That's gonna create the most power, and that's gonna help us rotate into the front side better. So that improves your lead leg block, it's gonna improve your overall rotation, it's gonna make it easier on your arm, and it's gonna improve the timing, which should help with control. So really, it knocks out, checks every box. That's why also they were talking a lot about that back leg staying connected, because if we're hitting and we're coming up, we lose all of that. So they both love the idea of keeping the back foot on the mound as long as possible, because that allows you to stay here. And then as we're rotating, we're turning together and getting that rotation into the lead leg, instead of hitting and coming up and losing that posture and getting into early back hip extension, or drifting down the slope, hitting and coming off that back leg and losing our power source that's leaking and not allowing us to rotate the hips properly. So a few really good cues there. We want to make sure that some of these things are more advanced concepts, they're simple to understand. They talked about a lot of things and there's a lot of deep knowledge in conversations. Obviously Bauer is an extremely intelligent guy. And when two major leaguers are having a conversation, it's really awesome to listen to. We just want to help kind of dumb it down a little bit so that you can understand and apply it to your mechanics. Not everyone's the same. Not everyone's going to look exactly like those two guys, but those are two high-level throwers, really smart guys, and we can definitely learn something from them.